but I really don't care. I'm going to ask anyway. How many of you have been to a hospital in the last year or so? Not necessarily in to be a patient, but in a hospital, even to visit, to get an x-ray, to see somebody.
Maybe.
Almost everybody. You ever noticed how we take hospitals for granted in our country? You ever thought about that? How we just assume there's somebody there, that there's doctors and nurses and people to take care of us when and if we get sick or have some sort of an accident? It was 2013 when Angie and I went to the Dominican Republic for Roy and Prue's wedding. And while we were there, Mom got sick and we had to take her to the hospital. And we were in another country and we just assumed that there would be a hospital there for her to go to. And thank the Lord there was. While we were there, we had a greater appreciation for a medical system here in America. Amen. It was like going back in time 50 years to that hospital. It truly was. We were thankful that it was there. But do you realize that there was a time when a hospital was a novel idea? Back in 2012, I took a history class. It was a Middle Ages history class at Northwestern Oklahoma State University. And my professor was telling the class at that time that the first hospital came about in the Middle Ages. And this was a time when Christians were traveling across Europe, visiting holy sites and other shrines and such. And many of them would get sick or they would have accidents along the way and they needed medical attention. But there wasn't any system there to help them. So there was a group known as the Knights Hospitallers who started a hospital, and they also provided military protection for those people who were traveling across the country. And this was, according to my professor, the first hospital. Later, I started investigating that myself. That just doesn't sound quite right. Maybe he's right, but I don't know. So I started digging a little bit deeper. And I found that I think he was mistaken. Because I found, for example, this lady here, Fabiola. I don't know where a picture went, but anyway.
It's on the other side.
Oh, there it is. It looks like a wall from here. She was born, we don't know when she was born. She died in 399. And Fabiola was a wealthy widow, a Roman citizen, who converted to Christ. And she started getting rid of her wealth, giving it to the poor. And she started taking people into her home, and she would provide medical care for them. And she spent a good portion of her wealth providing a place for the sick to come and be cared for. This was close to 1,000 years before the Knights Hospitallers. And there was a guy named St. Basil. Maybe you've heard of him. Very influential guy. He began distributing food to the poor in Caesarea. And he built a poorhouse and a hospice and a hospital in the 4th century. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, the council directed that every city that had a cathedral should also have a hospital to provide care for the travelers. So as early as the 4th century, hospitals started to pop up to care for people who were traveling. Mainly. They were also available for other people, but the word hospital actually comes from the Latin word hosp. And we get several of our words from that. Words like hospital, hospitality, hotel, because they are there to provide hospitality to people. It's their purpose. And the church also started many other things. Not just hospitals, but nursing homes, funeral homes, providing care for dying, and all of these different things to provide hospitality and love to their neighbor. And all of these hospitals, they largely came out of verses like this. These are the words of Jesus. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to eat or drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. Amen. The author of Hebrews gives us another perspective. He says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember the prisoner as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourself also are in the body. There is no doubt that the Bible in many, many places commands us to care for each other. Not only care for each other, but to care for those who are not a part of us, who are not a part of our family. To reach out and to show love and hospitality. This was not only a New Testament thing, this was a huge part of Jewish life. If you were a traveler going through Israel and you saw a house and you knocked on their door, they were obligated to provide for you. It was part of Jewish culture. They would feed you, they would put you up for the night. And if they didn't, they were condemned by the community. You care for one another. If someone's in need, you take care of them. That was their belief. That was their understanding. We all know this because the Bible is so clear about it. Yet, there are certain people who are especially gifted for this. There are certain people who draw closer and closer to God the more they serve other people. They are caregivers. These people are not above the menial tasks or even dirty and disgusting tasks. For these people, this is a labor of love and a devotion to God. The caregiver is never closer to God than when they are serving someone else. When they are literally being the hands and feet of Jesus. Hallelujah. In 2013, I had heart surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And while we were there, they had a museum down in the lobby of this is an old hospital, and it was St. Mary's Hospital, which would ultimately become Mayo Clinic, and they had a little museum there to honor it. And I found a little booklet in there, and it was talking about the duties of nurses in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I want to read these to you because they're fascinating. Daily duties of nurses. Daily sweep and mop the floor of your ward. Dust the patient's furniture and windowsills. Maintain an even temperature in your ward by bringing in coal for the day's business. Each day, fill kerosene lamps, clean chimneys, trim wicks, wash the windows once a week. The nurse's notes are important in aiding the physician's work. Make your pens carefully. You may whittle nibs to your individual taste. All right, I've got to ask you, who knows what whittling a nib is? I had to look this up.
Sharpening pencil.
Sharpening the end of the pen.
There you go. Few of you know it. I had to look it up. I had no idea what a nib was, whittling your nib. But anyway, there you go. And each nurse on day duty will report every day at 7 a.m. and leave at 8 p.m., except on the Sabbath, on which day you will be off from 12 noon to 2 p.m. How many of you want to be a nurse? Graduate nurses in good standing with the director of nurses will be given an evening off each week for courting purposes, or 2 evenings a week if you go to church regularly. So another good reason to go to church, right? And each nurse shall lay aside from each payday a goodly sum of her earnings for her benefits during her declining years, so that she will not become a burden. For example, if you earn $30 per month, you should set aside $15. Any nurses who smoke, uses liquor in any form, gets her hair done at a beauty shop. All right, how many of you are out being nurses now? Or frequents dance halls will give the director reason to suspect her worth, intentions, and integrity. The nurse who performs her labors and serves her patients and doctors faithfully and without fault for a period of 5 years will be given an increase by the hospital administration of 5 cents a day, providing there are no hospital debts there that are outstanding. Already got that one. There we go. I went through that list because as I read that, I thought, you know what? You don't do that for the money. Why do you do that? You've got a caregiving heart. Got a heart of compassion. A heart that wants to help other people. You don't haul coal in, trim the lantern, whittle your nibs, do all of this stuff, mop the floors, and do all of this just because it's a job. You can find a better job than that. Just do it because it's a caregiving heart. You see caregivers in many, many areas. I just use nursing because I think it's such a beautiful example of it. But there are many ways to be a caregiver. Mechanics. Fix somebody else's car. Helping a friend through a crisis. Lending money. Helping someone through substance abuse. Helping an illiterate person to read. Donating your time at a woman's shelter, a pregnancy center, or a soup kitchen.
Amen.
Repairing someone's house. Sending notes of encouragement. 1,000 other possibilities. We just donated the leftover coats to the Hearts for the Homeless. Perfect example of a care-giving ministry. Reaching out to the least of these. They don't do that because they want to be. They do that because it's a calling on their heart that God has given them. Working with these people that are smelly and dirty and and nasty because they love God. I find a lot of examples of caregivers in Scripture. But I think the most obvious was Jesus himself. In Mark 6, y'all are familiar with this story. Jesus was feeding the 5,000. Now, Jesus had had a busy day, and he was tired, and the disciples were tired. And he told them, let's get in the boat, and let's go to the other side of the lake so we can get away from everybody for a while, because we all need to rest. So they got in their boat, and they started away, but the people saw them, and they ran around the lake, and they got there ahead of him. Right? You know the story. And they got off of the boat, and Jesus said, when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd of them, that he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. That's the caregiver's heart right there. When they see someone in need and they have compassion for them. And even though he is tired, probably cranky, he was human just like the rest of us. He said, we need to take care of these people. Then in verse 35 and 36, when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, this place is desolate, and it's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Lord, it's late. We were tired when we came over here. We're still tired. Now you've been teaching all this time. Get rid of these people. Get them out of here so they can go home and get something to eat and we can get some rest. What did Jesus say? You give them something to eat. Can you imagine the disciples at that point? What? We're exhausted. We're tired. We need a break. Feed them. So the disciples pull out the trump card. Where'd it go? I didn't put it in there. They say, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, Lord. Sorry, nothing we can do. We tried. This is all we can come up with. We're going to have to send them away. Jesus says, not so fast. And he fed. He fed the multitude, even though they were tired and cranky and ready to rest. All because Jesus had a heart for these people. I'm not a caregiver, not near as much as I would love to be. It's not where my heart cries. Who is? I can imagine a couple of you that I know are. Yeah. Judy is too. Whether she acknowledges it or not. She's a caregiver. They see the needs of the world. You're a caregiver. You need to continue to look for those opportunities to serve God through serving your neighbor. And as you do, you will grow closer and closer to God in the process. Because that's your vehicle. That's the burden that God has laid on your heart. And you draw closer to God when you are ministering to someone else. Find your vehicles, find your ways to do it, and your spirituality will grow. You will become closer to God than you would ever imagine. Seek these things out. For in a very real sense, the caregivers are the hands and feet of Jesus working in this world. But the temptations for the caregiver are there as well. Caregivers can have a very judgmental attitude at times. Because they can look at the rest of the world They can look at those of us that aren't helping as they think we should and say, what's wrong with you? Don't you see these people and these needs out there? Keep going. Help. They need help. Do something. Right? Be harsh. They don't realize that that's not everyone's pathway to God. And there are other ways to help. We just donated all of those coats to Help for the Homeless. How many of you donated? Right? Yeah. You helped. Caregiver. And the caregivers need to realize that. There are different ways in which we can help without actually getting into the trenches with them. And not look at everyone else with condemnation. The caregiver also needs to be careful of self-serving. They need to make sure that they are truly serving others and not serving themselves. That they don't get to the point where they do this because it makes them feel better or even relieves their conscience, but to truly serve. If we just do it to be doing it, it becomes no better than the social gospel. And secondly, to do this to meet a need in your own life. Help someone else, and it can turn into codependency, where we can actually become the enablers to allow people to stay in their mess, rather than helping them to get out. And lastly, they can neglect those that are closest to them. And that's a very real and present danger for the caregivers. Because they can give so much, because there are so many needs out there. They give and give and give, and they have nothing left for their own families or even for themselves. This cannot be. Paul said that if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. If you're a caregiver, you need to care for other people, but not at the expense of yourself and your family. We need to keep those boundaries firmly in place. Now, as Jennifer comes, I want to read a very short, not even a full paragraph. This was written by Jim Garlow. I don't know how many of you know Jim Garlow or not. He's the pastor of Skyline Wesleyan Church in San Diego, California. A very outspoken Wesleyan pastor, very prominent in the district, and he had a wife a number of years ago who got cancer of some sort. And she ended up losing her battle with cancer and needed to be married. But during his wife's battle with cancer, he wrote this. He said, in June 2007, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. During those earliest days, there were challenging times when I was driven to my hands and knees. Carol was so nauseous. The vomiting so persistent. Her weight was plummeting, and the doctors could not get it stopped, no matter how hard they tried. Down on my hands and knees, cleaning up a terrible mess, I was groaning to God, saying, God, this isn't fair. Such and such a pastor is getting to do this, and such a pastor is getting to do that. I heard so clearly the voice of the Father saying, this is the best ministry you have ever had. You, at this moment, are most like Jesus. He writes, I have never complained again. I think he is so right that we can never be more like Jesus than when we are caring for the least of these. We are caring for the needy, caring for those who need us, whether they're out there in the world or they're in our own home. That's when we are most like Jesus. Now, as they played this closing hymn, I want to thank all your caregivers. We need you. We need more caregivers in our churches, in our families, and in our homes. And the rest of us who are not caregivers by nature need to do what we can to help the caregivers in the ways we can. Monetary donations, helping them behind the scenes, doing donations and such, helping the caregivers do what caregivers do. Be the support for them. So as we sing, let's thank God for the caregivers. Thank God that he was a caregiver for us. And look for ways to be caregivers ourselves.
The friendship starts with Jesus being our friend.